is part 2 of my conversation with Ryan, and you can probably find part 1 wherever you found this episode, or you're welcome to find the link in the show notes. But you're welcome to start right here, but I just thought you should know about that. So Ryan is the co-founder of Meta-Ideological Politics, which seeks to reframe ideology as an analytical tool instead of a fundamentalist dogma. His work focuses on political depolarization, countering violent extremism, diversity, equity, inclusion trainings, and the creation of conflict-resilient cultures. And Ryan is also a wonderful writer. Ryan has an excellent analysis on ideology and a unique approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And he also has some great ideas about how campaigns can be used to fight polarization. There is so much possibility, and there's so much that needs to change. And it's hard to be optimistic sometimes. And we talk about all that in this part of my conversation with Ryan. We ended part 1 of our conversation talking about straw man arguments, the ones where people are debating with the weakest arguments of their enemy, or steel man arguments, the one where we're arguing with the strongest elements of another perspective. And this brought us to Ryan's unique concept of the titanium man approach, where one speaks to the best of the other's perspective and might even know about what they believe than they do. It turns out that actively building higher ground together is a powerful way of connecting across the divide. So let's dive in and learn more about Ryan's awesome titanium man approach in practice. With no further ado, this episode is recorded in March of the year 2022. Please enjoy part 2 of my conversation with Ryan Nakade. Right, so that can be really cool, and it really opens things up, and that can be really powerful. But then you take it to another level, and this is, I think, part of where you're actually doing some of your work with the titanium.
Yes, totally. Yeah, so the steel man, right, as you were saying, is re-articulating someone's argument or showing that you understood what they were saying in its most clear, lucid form and highlighting the strongest points of their argument, such that when you repeat it back to them, they'll say, yeah, that's exactly what I was saying. Right. You know that you got it, that you're actually representing their argument accurately. Titanium man is going one step beyond the steel man, and it's making their argument more powerful, more complex, more nuanced, and more robust than they made it themselves. So it's going beyond a steel man to not only say, I'm going to repeat exactly what you said as clearly as possible, highlighting the strongest points of what you said. I'm actually going to modify the argument like a straw man, right? Because you're still modifying what they're saying, but making it even more complex and more powerful and infusing more perspectives and frameworks into it.
And this is part of what happens when you do that deep research and you like read all their foundational materials that they probably haven't even read themselves. So they're just parroting someone else, but you actually know what the point of it. And so helping them be like, well, the real reason why you believe this is because of this, this, and this, you know, and then have them be like, I didn't even know that kind of moment. Like, yeah, that sounds great. That's better than I could have imagined. Yeah.
Right, exactly. That's the idea. And they may not totally agree with the titanium man, but it shows at least that you've really put in a lot of effort into contemplating their perspective and creatively regurgitating it in your own words, right? So they'll at least respect that you've thought a lot about it and have a different angle than they have that's not just an attack on it.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think that there's part of this, and maybe this gets into the polarity, man, but like there's also the ability to pull out those things that are actually strong about their argument and being able to low light the things that are not working in their approach, right? And it's funny because I was listening to an interview with Steve McIntosh just a bit ago, this morning actually, and Steve McIntosh is a political philosopher who's really in the world of integral theory and has created a group called the Post-Progressive and Post-Progressive Post. Totally recommend people check it out. And, you know, he really he's wrote a book called Developmental Politics, and it's like how does America upgrade to its better version of itself? And one of the things he says is that of all the different political ideologies, each of them have something that's great to offer. He calls it their dignity, and that each of them have a disaster, some sort of shadow side that they're, and that all the groups can benefit from just like lifting up the part that's good about themselves, and by trying to check the parts that are the shadow sides, the disaster sides of them. And so in this Titanium Man, I hear that pulling out the like, yeah, I just like with the Titanium Man, there's something about lifting up what's good about the perspective and helping them address like their shadow side. So it's like an improvement, some sort of upgrade there. Yeah.
One other thing I wanted to say too was, and I'd be interested in your opinion on this, Duncan. Being a mediator and having a mediation background, right? For the longest time, my approach to these kind of conversations was to come in as if I know nothing about the person's ideology or beliefs, and to take a kind of lower power role and be really humble and ask a bunch of open-ended questions, having them educate me in a one-way street, right? So, oh, what does that mean to you? What does that look like to you? How did you come to believe that? What do you think about this, right? And they would basically give answers, and I would just paraphrase and ask open-ended questions. It was very neutral and very mediator-ish. That's a great start. I think that's a great way to approach conversations, and I still largely adopt that style or attitude. What I started finding out though was that the Titanium Man is a little different. It's actually probably the opposite of that. It's this attitude of like, hey, I might actually be more of an expert than you on your own thing. And that actually has benefits that the kind of humble, neutral media approach doesn't have. And that's the fact that people tend to respect you more when you demonstrate that your knowledge of a subject and how much you've thought about their stuff. That can't come out by just asking open-ended questions and being humble and being in like a lower power position. So I think both are necessary depending on the circumstance. And I definitely oscillate between those two styles in the same conversation. But as a mediator, I've always had a bias towards the former approach, and the Titanium Man expertise latter approach is my latest development that I found to be extremely helpful, especially when you're talking to people who ideologically believe that it's not their responsibility to educate you, or that they just don't want to tell you more. So it's like, oh, okay, this guy's clueless, F him, right? But now that I've read all your stuff, I've thought about it, I've reframed it in my own way, then it's like, oh, this guy gets me and he's put into effort to understand me. Cool, I respect this guy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think I understand the question that's in there too. So as a mediator, one of the things that I find that's really the whole process of mediation is basically like getting people from out of their positions where they're usually stuck and that's having some conflict about, getting down to find out what are their actual needs and values and underlying interests that are motivating whatever's happening, and having them have a conversation based on that level. And so as a mediator, we bring that forward by giving them a chance to talk about what their experience is and reflecting it back in such a way that the other person can start to hear what they're saying, right? One of the challenges, though, and it's like this little hidden challenge in mediation, is that a lot of people don't actually know what's actually going on for them when they believe certain things. Like they don't necessarily, they're not super dialed in to what their underlying needs are, so that they could be talking about a strategy. I need the dishes to be da 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 da, and not, and they might even think that it has to do with cleanliness, but really there's a conversation about respect that they want to have the other person cleaning up the dishes. They don't know how to articulate. They probably never really thought about it, and that's it. And if you ask them, why is it important to you? Like, because it's just supposed to be clean. That's just the way you do it, might be the answer. And they might, and it's like, well, there's something else there. And so you can ask questions to get people down there, but being able to recognize. So I've started coming up with something that I call you statements, and I haven't really taken this out on the road, but told many people about it. But so an I statement is me talking about my experience, my perspective, my feelings, my needs, and then making a request that's not a demand, right? A you statement that I'm in this framework would be me taking a stab at. So it seems like this is what you're observing. It seems like this is what you feel about it. It seems like this is what you need right now. And it sounds like what you're requesting is this, sort of like setting the person up with what they're trying to communicate. And so I feel like that's where that bridge can start to happen, right? So first of all, asking questions like, hey, why do you believe what you believe? Tell me why this is important to you. How do you understand power relationships? Some of those great questions you offered earlier. And then after listening a bit, saying like, okay, if I understand it right, this is really what's going on for you. And then like being able to start bringing in that, like all that research that you've done, is the fact that you really have a good lock on it, and helping them articulate what they're trying to say in a way that they didn't even know how to articulate it. And I think that that's helpful in conflict resolution and in this trans-ideological conversation that you're talking about.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's what a good mediator or even a good therapist helps people to do, right? Is someone is confused about their inner reality. They're confused about what their real underlying needs, values, and interests are. And they're not directly articulating them for whatever reason, right? They haven't done the introspection or meditation or whatever. And so they're just speaking from a more surface place. And through open-ended questions and gentle probing, you're able to extract the real stuff that they write, the real core values or whatever the issue is really about to them. One thing I've noticed that's become a problem, and again, this is where I think meta-ideological politics and this style of thinking can be helpful, is that sometimes people are so locked into the ideological frame that all of their core values and interests, the real direct human part of their values and interests, will not come to the surface unmediated by the ideological frame. In other words, everything becomes scaffolded through the ideology, and the language that's used to understand their inner reality is going to be ideologically laden. My kind of go-to example would be if I went to the Bush administration and asked why they invaded Iraq in 2003, and I talked to Bush, Cheney, and Rumsfeld, I don't think they're gonna admit what their real interests are. Now, obviously, this is different because these are political leaders who might have a different agenda, and they don't want the public to know why we really invaded Iraq. But everything will be, all of their answers or rationale would be scaffolded through the ideology of neoconservatism. You're going to hear a bunch of neocon talking points. I've seen this same phenomena happen with many mediations, especially in regards to social justice issues and conflicts around like DEI and identity. People's needs and so forth will come out through the language of kind of a social justice anti-racist paradigm. And if the other person doesn't understand that paradigm or doesn't like that paradigm, it becomes impossible to have a direct human conversation. Do you know what I'm saying? Like instead of just talking about your feelings or your experiences or your values, it all becomes laden through the language and conceptual framings of the social justice paradigm. And then that causes a lot of breakdown. So part of what I think about doing is how do we help people's interests, see the signal of their deeper interest as it's strained through the cloth of their ideology, right? And then from there, being able to find openings in their own framework so that those deeper aspects can come out more directly and in a way that the other party that they're in conflict with can understand, while helping both parties to know that they are indeed coming from a framework, right? So the positive develop, this is kind of like a transformative mediation thing, right? But part of my definition of transformative mediation is by the end of the mediation, both parties will have more meta-ideological awareness and the frames of references that they're coming from that they were formerly locked into without awareness.
Yeah, totally. That makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I mean, 'cause what I hear is just like as a tool that one can be like that. And I think this is where like this kind of cross field community conversation gets really helpful, is that like for mediators out there that are, using the tools of mediation for garden variety kind of conflicts, there's a real power that can happen in recognizing the role that ideology is playing, and that when people are in their ideological talking point mode, that's interfering with their ability to really talk about their own lived experience, or their, really what's important to them, and to hear the other person because they're not speaking in that same language, highlighting the what's going on with ideology, both for yourself as a facilitator and a mediator, but also with them, can be helpful. So I know that you've been actually been doing some really interesting sort of DEI work, and I think this is a good example of this kind of meta-ideological mediation that you've been doing. So can you give us a sense of what this practically looks like in a scenario where people are stuck in their ideological talking points? But
Love to. My
yeah,
favorite subject. So
yeah,
yeah, I
great.
lead DEI workshops for mediators. So I lead like a mediation forum DEI, and also just organizations and city governments and so forth, like training staff and that kind of thing. So I want to tell a story. So I led a training for a small city in Oregon, and everyone in the training except for one person was basically like a conservative. Several Trump supporters, all of them are forced to attend this mandatory DEI training. And the first guy that walked in, he looked at me, I looked at him, and I know in both of our minds, we said, oh shit, this is going to be a rough 6 hours, right? Like I felt really bad that he was forced to attend this when he probably ideologically hates it. And I thought I was going to have a rough time trying to convey like what systemic racism or any of these things are to someone who's probably very opposed to it and has probably had a lot of very bad experiences with very bad DEI trainings where he felt attacked and shamed and so forth, right? So this was a great experiment for me in trying to how do we convey things in a way where people who are resistant to them or allergic to these ideas can best grok. So I've distilled a few principles from this experience. So the first one is simply to explain things meta-ideologically. So I always welcome everyone, welcome to the training. My name is Ryan Nakade, blah blah blah, and then I say, for this training, we're going to be learning about DEI and racial justice and so forth. This is a frame. This is a way of thinking. It is a school of thought. It is not by any means the last say on reality. It is a perspective that I think is a helpful perspective to have in our toolkit, right? It's a helpful lens that we can put on to see reality in a different way for a time being and gain insights and gain a greater awareness of ourselves and the society that we live in. But it's just a lens. So my encouragement to you is to try it on and play with it, see what happens, see what you like, see what you don't like, and then we'll talk about it at the end. That takes off 50-60% of the anxiety and tension, not by saying this is the way or this is reality, but simply by acknowledging this is a lens. The second principle is non-exclusion. Non-exclusion means this lens is not, I'm not trying to supplant your lens or your core values or your beliefs. This is a supplemental perspective to buttress whatever you already believe. It is to add on to what you already believe, to enrich the complexity of who you are, right? It's to enrich your understanding of yourself and to enrich the understanding of your community. It is not about replacing what you believe or deconstructing what you believe and replacing it with what I'm about to teach you. That takes off the rest of the 30% of the anxiety, right? Then the third part is, like, oh, we're exploring our personal identity, we're exploring our social identity. People feel like all of these labels, right? There's all these labels. Like why are we talking about our identity? Why are we talking about race? All these labels. The reason why people don't like labels or ideology in general, but in this case, labels, is because they can reduce the complexity of our being, right? If my understanding of Duncan Autry is nothing more than he's a white privileged male, Duncan's going to feel like I'm not seeing Duncan for who he is as a unique and complex individual, right? I've reduced you to crude identity categories. I can't see beyond them. So my criteria, I say, whenever we explore labels is, do the labels enhance the complexity of who you are, or do they reduce them? Use them additively where they can enhance the complexity, but you can't be reduced to the labels. So this is the complexity part, right? Any label or any abstraction should be used to enrich the complexity of who we are and our understanding of things and not reduce them. And how do we ensure that they're enriching them? By using them non-exclusively. So one example, so the first exercise I give people is, we're going to explore every aspect of your personal identity. What is Duncan's favorite food? What is Duncan's like life motto, right? What are some hobbies that no one else knows about? And so they fill out an entire chart exploring your personal identity and who you are and how you see yourself on your own terms. Once we have that, and then we share that as an icebreaker, let's explore the social side of Duncan. Let's explore race. Let's explore our identity. Let's explore the systemic context that you were raised in. Let's explore your cultural background, etc. Now that we have these two charts, personal identity and social identity, let's put them together for an even more complex, beautiful tapestry, a picture, a portrait of who you are. Let's see how the social factors, the systemic factors, have constructed our personal reality, right? Where do those two factors blend together? And now let's share them with each other, right? And we're celebrating the richness and the complexity of that. Everyone who hates the training ends up loving it at the end of it when you teach it like this, right? And I really want to like scale this approach because I've seen so many resistant people light up by the end of it, and everyone's happy and everyone feels like they learned something that permanently changed the way they look at life.
And within this specific moment with this one guy, like how did that one go? Was he in? You guys were in? Did you have a connection by the end of that 6 hours?
So I actually had to fight back tears. So at the end of the training, we do a go around and say, what's one thing you took away from this? And when it was at the beginning of the training, when I asked for the initial go around, right, I asked him I asked everyone, what are you looking forward to and what are you nervous about? And all he said was like, I'm here. And that's it. By the end of the training, I asked the same question and the next day, and he said he lit up, right? He just like lit up and he was like, oh my God, I didn't believe, I didn't see before that every situation there's some kind of subtle power dynamic based on an innumerable amount of variables, right? It could be race, could be age, could be generation, could be income, could be your position within the organization, and that there's always a dynamic going on, and thinking more critically about how those impact people I might not have thought of. I was like, holy shit. Like this is a complete transformation, and just his excitement was so beautiful to see that. So yeah, I really like that.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, see, because what I'm appreciating is this layer of like, can we use this social category, that's salient in this framework, or can we use this framework to add another lens to create more complexity? And if it's reducing complexity, then we're not doing it quite right.
Yeah.
And yeah, just personally, that's helpful for me to understand how I've come to understand my role as a white male, class privileged, and American, and all these different social identities that I have, privileged social identities, and and that. But then I'm also, an individual who has like, I love doing crochet and I like podcasting, and I'm fascinated with politics, and I really believe that we can create an Omni-Win, omnipartial world, and I like fractals, and whatever these different things that make me me. And there's a way that it's really helpful for me to be able to layer on, okay, that's all the things that are me, but when I'm interacting with other people, I got to remember that they're seeing me as someone with a ton of social power, in the dynamic. Because if I just try to be like, I'm always just trying to be good and that's all I am, and then I'm missing something. And so I'm just, again, appreciating how, like, it's like another layer that we can add on. And I know, like, just reading your essay about diaphanous anti-racism, but basically how to create like a transparent, like seeing race with racial transparency, sort of like, I see that your skin's there, but that's not the thing. I'm not stopping at skin color. I'm not stopping at your social identity. That I'm seeing you all the way through, but I'm recognizing that this extra layer, this extra lens is giving me some more information about what's going on here.
Right, exactly. And the idea of race transparency is that it's a transcendent middle way between color blindness and woke color consciousness, right? You're saying it's like looking through a pane of glass. Like I see that there's a pane of glass, I see that there's a window, but I'm also seeing through and beyond the window. So it's how do you acknowledge something without re-reifying it or essentializing it and rendering it opaque, right? We render it transparent and see the systemic structures and forces that crystallized or played a role in shaping our identity and worldview, right? Our positionality, as it's called in the social justice literature, but not getting fixated on it, right? And seeing beyond it, seeing it as an aspect of our being that's probably important to reflect on and understand, but that's by no means the end of who you are.
Thank you. I want to see if there's bring us to the last little bits of this conversation with some other questions here. Though I know that all these themes are going to keep on looping in. So, question that I want to be asking all the guests in this season and in this podcast for now is, if we're going to upgrade and improve our democracy, our political system, our culture around politics, what do you think it can look like? Like, how good can we get this, right? Like, where do you see the places for improvement? But very specifically, when you think out the next, like, we have a midterm election this year, and then we have another national elections going on in 2024, 2028. How are you going to know if we're getting better or worse? Like, what are some of the metrics that you would like to see change as we continue down our democratic future? And if there's anything that you want to sort of loop in around just like your thoughts about the role of like politicians and so forth in this, that might be an interesting place to drop it in.
Yeah. This is obviously a very big question, and in terms of like a metric or key performance indicators and so forth to assess if polarization and so forth is improving. Yeah, I'm not really sure, just because I think I'm so pessimistic. Like I'm so just I think all of the incentive structures and technological developments and features are working against integration or harmonization. And so I think it's challenging for me to even think of what it getting better would even look like, just because I just do not believe it will get better at scale, which is a pretty pessimistic answer, but that is kind of where I'm at right now. I think the thing that I'd like to see from, well, with politicians, I think the biggest thing is how they campaign. I think is something I think about a lot, right? So I've read books on, I've had an interest in running for office for a while, and I've read a lot of books on how to run for office successfully and win. And it's basically a guide. All these books are basically a guide to how to polarize people to get them angry so they vote for you, right? So the incentives are completely perverse. And the goal of a politician is to incite outrage so that you galvanize your base. Now, there are structural reforms that I think could help with that in theory, like what some things Andrew Yang is proposing with his Forward Party, like ranked choice voting and open primaries, right? So there are structural reforms to the democratic system that can reconstitute the incentive landscape. But I would really like to see politicians think about campaigning in such a way that by the end of the campaign, win or lose, you did something of net benefit to the community. Maybe people are more educated about an issue that they didn't think about before. Maybe you move the Overton window to a policy that is really important, like universal basic income for that Yang did in 2020, or universal healthcare that Bernie did in 2016, or whatever. I could name any politician for anything that wasn't reaching public consciousness, and then you help bring that into the spotlight, even if you lost, right? Maybe in all of the conversations you've had going door to door and canvassing people, you did some really deep listening to people, and they felt heard, and they felt like they met someone who cared. And even if you lost, you still did some good for the community because people had a chance to had some political therapy for 10 minutes while they talked to you on their front porch, right? So I like to see people thinking about, how do I create positive ripple effects and positive externalities through any course of action that I pursue, regardless if you hit the target or not. And that's the same thing too with policy creation, right? So even if the policy doesn't achieve its stated goal, will it still create some kind of positive externality that will benefit some stakeholder group in some way? And I could list a lot of examples, but that's my general take, is that kind of shift in thinking I would love to see. We're not going to see it probably, but I would still love, that's like my fantasy.
I just did like a little series of videos about like hopelessness and despair and PESA optimism, and so make sure that I can share those with the folks who are listening. You can find the links wherever. But yeah, it's hard to look at things and be like, wow, things are really stacked against us right now. And it's not like large scale change. It seems really challenging. And one of the things that appear in this that might be interesting to like there's something about the campaigning part, about showing like we can have a different approach to like campaigning, and that really working on policies and starting conversations that are of a wider benefit, like no matter what, like that trying to have a positive impact becomes like the standard by which we measure, you know, what people are doing. And there's an interesting way there about, I mean, that's like a little bit of like a cultural standard that kind of needs to happen. It's hard to do that when there aren't really very many examples of it. And it just occurs to me that someone's going to have to start modeling this, right? And so I see as a measure or a KPI or some sort of metric that we can see whether or not things are shifting is I would like to see there be some politicians at least that are out there trying to say, my goal here is to get the wider good, to transcend polarization. I want to solve these issues not by giving you the best policy platform, but because I'm going to make sure that we together figure out what the best policy is on this, or, you know, bringing in these new factors and these new approaches. And my sense is that there is a way like that. It will require individuals running for office and putting that, like, and coming at it with a different approach than what the system keeps on getting them to do.
I give
And
two more examples I forgot to
yeah,
give about this. So two fantasies I have. I would try this if I run for office. So one would be part of my campaign I would like to do a public mediation or public facilitation as the candidate between conflicting stakeholders in the community. So everyone sees, if I was a political leader, how would I listen to, take into consideration, and steelman the needs and interests of diverse community stakeholders and try to arrive towards a resolution that I'm facilitating. I would actually build that into my campaign platform. The second one would be going to long form conversations with other candidates. So instead of being on the debate stage with a bunch of 2-minute sound bites and hashtags, talking points, I would say, hey, let's go on a podcast together. Let's meet somewhere at City Hall or whatever, right? If it's a local race or if it's a presidential campaign, let's go on Joe Rogan and let's talk for 3 hours. Like, let's actually get into it and see how much substance you have, how deeply you've thought about these things. And if people, so this is where I think leveraging rivalrous dynamics for the greater good can be possible, which is actually what I'm more excited about than trying to move to non-rivalry and non-zero sum, is to say, hey, if you don't agree to talk to me for 3 hours, I'm going to use that and I'm going to like attack you for not doing that. And so basically that will hopefully give every politician an incentive to have a longer, deeper, more substantive, more nuanced, more complex conversation. And that will eventually create a democratic ecosystem that selects for candidates who are able to have those conversations and to display substance, right? So we don't select for whoever is the most kind of Trumpian, soundbitey, inflammatory person. And the last thing I would try to do is I would really tinker with different kind of incentive structures on a top down, where we should start really prioritizing funding and grants for people doing depolarization and Omni-Win type of work, right? Doing meta-ideological work. And we can come up with our own criteria that we can then prioritize funding to. So right now in Portland, all the rage is DEI, 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 DEI. And that's what's prioritized, right? So when you apply for a grant, whether it's a public grant or a private grant, 50% of the questions are DEI questions. So I would love to see that expanded to also include depolarization, community integration, Omni-Win consideration, meta-ideological awareness. How do we develop programs and policies and select leaders who value these things? And you can do that by changing the incentive structures and selection mechanisms. And I think that could be done top down, right? By talking to leaders of boards of foundations, or talking to the city and talking to the mayor and getting them to prioritize funding for these programs, and even having like a contest in the community about like an anti-debate contest, right, where we can talk about a polarizing issue and the winner is not going to be assessed on via conventional debate criteria, but the winner will be assessed with a new set of criteria. That's how well were you able to steelman the other side, how well were you able to move towards a joint resolution? How well were you able to consider all of the stakeholders in the community and all of their needs and interests, right? And so we're upregulating people with those skills and then giving them leadership positions instead of politicians who just want power and will polarize even more. So that those are some fantasies that I have and that I would try if I was running for office.
It's really good. And this is where we get to be the intellectual doppelgangers, because I'm like, yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking, and just, I think it'd be so powerful for people to see someone running for office like actually play that role as facilitator and mediator for the different perspectives, and an idea of the long form conversation, like getting out of this debate situation. Like, there's something about, I always think about that, like that nightmare debate that happened between like Biden and Trump back in the day, but just like all of those questions that were being asked were great questions, and we weren't getting anywhere closer to any answers of them. So like, how do we want to be in relationship to China? How do we want to be in relationship to Russia? How do we want to deal with climate change? Those are all conversations that really could use a good 3-hour, 10-hour, 3-year conversation with like thoughtful exchanges. And it's not those sound bites aren't going to help us through some of these. And my sense is that kind of approach would be very refreshing to people. I know that, the world asks, we want our politics to be less negative, but the negative politics does get people elected, and so that's why people keep on coming back to it. But I haven't really seen anyone really try to be that kind of bridge builder. And yeah, and then your last point about making sure that there's incentives for this. And I'm interested in, thinking about who needs to talk to who, like here. But Bill Shireman, who is one of the last guests that I had on Fractal Friends, my last podcast, who wrote the book called In This Together, was a Republican businessman and environmentalist, but he has some. We talked at the very end about them creating like a platform or a screening test for politicians, being like, hey, we're going to give you a bunch of support and money if you're willing to fight polarization, like not be trapped in ideological things or just toe your own line. That's going to be worth following up with, because I'm not sure exactly how that developed in the last 2 years since we spoke. So I'll just say, we were talking about transitioning to a Q&A here, and if any of you do have some questions you would like to ask, you're welcome to drop something into the chat, and we can give you space to ask some questions. If not, I'm just going to keep on talking to you for a little bit, Ryan. So if anyone wants to drop in any questions, they're welcome to share them here. So Ryan, I guess the question I want to ask you then is, who else and what else? Like, who do I need to talk to in this Omni-Win project podcast? Like, who do you think needs to be in part of this conversation? Who do you see doing cool things that are inspiring you? Who do you want to talk to if we had, and or what else are we missing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So to your first question, a few people that came to mind was my friend Ari Allen, who's doing something called the Reconstitution Project, which is a team of folks, including myself, who are trying to create a new constitution updated to the 21st century that covers 10 core questions relating to politics and economics and society and so forth. And he's doing some really cool things with his Reconstitution project. And I think it's the closest thing to like an all-win or Omni-Win constitution, like Omni-Win US constitution is the goal, right? To translate it into your language. So that's something I would really follow up with, or reach out to him. I could connect you to if you're interested. Right, like how do we codify Omni-Win principles into a constitutional document? Right, that's the project. And he's a lawyer, so he is really good at thinking about these things on a technical and legal level. Right. Yeah, that's the main thing that comes to my mind. I think another thing I would look into would be other kind of like systems thinkers or complexity thinkers, because one thing I'm interested in with the concept of Omni-Win, and this gets back to the idea of boundary judgments and systems epistemology, right? Which is, are we truly considering all of the stakeholders who are impacted by anything, and if they win or not, right? Because you may think that everyone wins with a certain policy or a certain idea or a certain action, but then there are actually a stakeholder group that you weren't aware of that lost because the negative externalities of X proposal were placed onto them, right? So how do we think about who we're considering when we think of Omni-Win? And I think the systems thinkers have done a lot of really good work using kind of systemic stakeholder analysis techniques, like who I mentioned, Gerald Migley, and the whole school of management British systems thinkers called critical systems thinking. So this includes Robert Flood, Michael Jackson, and Werner Ulrich. And their work is all about systems epistemology. So Werner Ulrich has a method called critical systems heuristics. And that's something I think that should be integrated into any kind of Omni-Win platform.
Those are some great suggestions. I appreciate like both on that, like the system, the structural aspect, and the recognition of the systems approach. And so I'll definitely be following up with you about some of these folks, because that, there's and I still find it harder to articulate that a systems approach to things breaks us out of some of the binary questions, right? Is everything, are we all connected, or are we individuals? Do I care about the web, or do I care about myself? That for sure, systems approach recognizes that they're one and the same and inextricable, and they have a way of explaining that. But I also really appreciate this reminder to be paying attention to, like, who do we consider to be the constituents?
Mm-hmm.
Who do we consider to be the stakeholders here? And recognizing that that's beyond what you think, right? And actually beyond what you're able to even understand, right? That a complex systems approach really points out that, like, yes, the system is following certain rules, but there's so many variables here that we can't really predict what's going to happen in different things. And it seems to me that, yeah, that there's a way that, yeah, it's also the systems thinking reminds us this is an ongoing process. This isn't like we're not getting any fixed state here. It's a dynamic, unfolding thing. And so if we decide that we value the different perspectives now at the top, we hopefully will be appreciating those different perspectives throughout, and having a chance for them to continue to be like, yeah, this isn't working for me, or this isn't working for us, or to continue to check and to notice, like, well, what else is happening here. So I appreciate just the reminder of the deep complexity of any kind of changes that we make. And yeah, there's a lot of great wisdom there. Yeah.
There's also a paper I'll send you by Gerald Milley called Systemic Mediation, and it's so right up your alley. It's all about this. Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Okay, wonderful. Great. And so I think I'm just going to kind of wrap this up with like a little bit of a framing here. I'm stepping into this project and this whole thing about trying to figure out how we can do this. And I'm setting a North Star that's way far out, right? And I'm not sure if this is possible for us to fix it. I'm in the same kind of optimistic category as you there. But yet it seems like it's worth it. And it seems like that the world actually does want some change in our system. And so this is just the beginning. This is literally the second conversation of this whole podcast. And I look forward to exploring more about this, and then trying to deepen these conversations and take them to the next level, and to get even all of the nuanced ideologies of the people who are looking for how do we fix polarization and how do we fix our democracy, and to get those to understand each other's approaches. So I just want to say thank you for being here at the very beginning, and I look forward to having you back and to have further conversations with you. And I'll make a recommendation. If people are listening to this and they hear like what Ryan's saying, check out Ryan's Medium page. He writes wonderful articles about a lot of the topics we've discussed today. And Ryan, how else might people find you if they wanted to find out more about what you're up to?
Well, we have a YouTube channel called Meta-Ideological Politics. I do that with my co-host, Nate Kaufman. He's a conservative Republican. I'm more on the left, so we can have that red-blue dynamic going. And you can reach out to me on Twitter at Ryan the Goat Guy. I'm also on Facebook. And if you want to send me an email, it's ryannakade@gmail.com. And I'd love to hear from you and collaborate.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for being part of this. Thank you so much for listening to the Omni-Win Project podcast. This episode was with Ryan Nakade, the co-founder of Meta-Ideological Politics. This was part 2 of my conversation with Ryan. If you're looking for part 1, it should be in your podcast feed wherever you found this one. Either way, you should go right now to your podcast app or wherever you're listening to this and subscribe to this show. This episode is just the beginning. I have so many more amazing people and ideas that I look forward to bringing to you. For now, I'm grateful for Ryan for being on this show and for all the support that he's given me in bringing this dream into reality. If you want more information about Ryan or Meta-Ideological Politics, I encourage you to check out their YouTube channel. Go find those links in the show notes right now. And now, as you step into the rest of your day, I invite you to remember that we are all co-creating the future right now, and we all have a role to play in the whole. Thank you for listening to the Omni-Win Project podcast. Have a great day.